Good evening, Dom. What I'm about to tell you happened when I was 18. Today I'm 22 and living in San Antonio, Texas. It was my last year in high school, but it was also when COVID started to spread intensely and everything began shutting down, including my school. Although everyone was supposed to stay home and quarantine, my group of friends and I were going out more than ever. With most non-essential places closed, there weren't many options for fun. But here's something about me. I love exploring urban areas and places known to be haunted. To this day, I still do it. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've had some tense moments with homeless people, strange cults, and even had a gun pointed at me. But nothing compared to the strange and frightening experience I had on this particular occasion while exploring. It was around this time that I started talking to a girl who studied with me in high school. Her name was Mariana. If it weren't for her confirming my alibi about what happened that night, I'm sure none of my friends would have believed me. We were starting to go out, but somehow I convinced her to explore a natural park in the middle of the night at 3 in the morning here in San Antonio. The park is called Schnabel. During the day it's pleasant, safe, and has beautiful scenery, but at night it can be dangerous, and the police usually block the entrances to keep people away. In 2016, a 24-year-old woman named Laura Campos was brutally murdered there with over 20 stab wounds, and in 2021 a boy was shot while exploring the forest. Mariana and I arrived at the park around 3 in the morning. The darkness was total and extremely frightening. The trees did an excellent job blocking out the moonlight, and I avoided using the flashlight so my eyes could adjust to the lack of light. Besides, I didn't want to attract attention with a light visible from a distance, so I preferred to keep everything off while exploring. We had already been walking along the main trail for about 15 to 20 minutes. I didn't plan to stay there for long because the place felt strange and quiet that night. I knew a path that led off the main trail and back to where my truck was parked, so I suggested to her that we take this shortcut, completing a loop instead of going back the same way. She agreed and we started walking along the alternative trail. We had barely entered this path for 2 minutes when, out of nowhere, a flute started playing. Mariana and I stopped immediately and looked at each other, trying to understand. Whoever was playing seemed to follow a precise rhythm, as if it were a rehearsed melody. But I didn't have time to think that it could sound nice. It was far too scary. As I mentioned, I don't scare easily, but after about 15 seconds of listening to that flute solo, Mariana started trembling and looked on the verge of tears. I was just there, listening, until she started praying, asking God to save her and forgive her sins. That's when the gravity of the situation dawned on me. To be clear, it was very hard to pinpoint where the flute sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the main trail, running parallel to our path, with a strip of forest 30 to 50 meters wide separating us. However, the sound kept getting louder and closer, as if it were practically on top of us. Mariana could barely focus from fear, so I realized I had to stay strong to get us out of there. I know this might sound a bit cliché, but I said to her, "Don't worry, I won't let anything happen to you." Then I suggested that we run off the path to escape, and that's what we did. We took off running. I think the flute stopped playing, but it was hard to notice since I was more focused on getting out of there. We had barely gone 10 meters when suddenly we heard rustling in the bushes and the crackling of leaves and branches before something big crossed the path right in front of us. It could very well have been a deer or some large wild animal, but the strange thing was that you could feel the size of whatever it was. I don't know if it was a sensation brought by the wind or something else. The point is that I never saw a silhouette or shape in front of us. Another strange thing is that we didn't hear it approaching or moving away. We only caught the movement at the exact moment it crossed right in front of us. As soon as we felt and heard that thing cross the trail, we did the obvious. We turned and ran in the other direction until we got back to the point where we first heard the flute. And then, as if the player had been waiting for our return, the flute started playing again very loudly and so close it seemed to be right on top of us. This time the sound seemed to mix with bells, something that resembled Irish music, but still maintaining a cadence. Even so, it was impossible to identify where the sound was coming from. It seemed to surround us completely. At that point, my fight-or-flight instinct kicked in because we were cornered. We had two choices: go back down the path off-road, where we heard that scary movement crossing right in front of us, or return to the main trail where the flute and whoever was playing it were. The alternative path was definitely scarier, surrounded by dense and completely dark forest, while at least the main trail was paved. I looked at Mariana, who was still trembling with fear, and said, "Let's start running down the main trail back to the truck." We ran back. The adrenaline was pumping, and we turned what would have been a 20-minute walk into a 7 to 8-minute run. At some point while running, the flute sound must have stopped, but I didn't even notice, focused as I was on getting out of there as fast as possible. Along the way, we passed a portable bathroom placed randomly there, and I felt a chill down my spine just thinking about the possibility of someone being on the other side or even hiding inside, as it was right in the parallel direction from where we heard that sound before. Fortunately, I didn't see anyone or any sign of someone being around. In fact, my truck was the only car parked at the main entrance of the forest. When we got there, I got into the vehicle and we quickly drove away. The next day, I told the story to all my friends and went online to see if anyone had experienced something similar. Some people report encounters with ghosts, cults, or even animals making scary noises. But a soft, rhythmic flute melody? I didn't find anything about it, or maybe I didn't search enough. I tried to consider all possibilities. There are some houses that eventually lead to a neighborhood on the distant edge of the forest, but those houses are at least a few kilometers away, and we were deep in the woods. There was no way the sound could have traveled that far, especially considering it was 3 in the morning and the flute sounded as clear as day. And in the end, I never found out who was playing that flute or what crossed in front of us. As I write this story, I still get chills. The more I think about what happened, the more it feels like something paranormal rather than a regular scary experience. I really don't know if it was a person, a ghost, a cult, or something else. I still hope someone can give me a rational explanation for what we saw. Since then, I've never gone back to that forest at night. I continue exploring mysterious places, but I've never encountered anything like that again. I'm 20 years old and work as a pharmacy technician at a medium-sized hospital in northwest Alabama. My shift is at night, starting in the early evening at 6 and going until 4 in the morning. Additionally, I'm also responsible for restocking the surgical rooms. I work a full week, 7 days straight, and then get 7 days off. Those 7 days on duty are exhausting, but the time off makes it all worth it. My schedule starts on a Thursday and ends on a Wednesday. So on the 6th night of work, which falls on a Tuesday, I left a little earlier to spend some time with my wife at her aunt's house, which is about half an hour from our place. She was looking after her younger cousins while her aunt and uncle were away. The house, with no curtains, made her feel somewhat uncomfortable during the nights she spent there. I hadn't been there from the start because I was still in my work week, and she thought it wouldn't be worth it if I arrived just in the morning around 5, only to fall asleep as soon as the sun came up. But on the last night with the kids, she was especially anxious, so I said I would go. She's stubborn, but this time she thanked me and relaxed as soon as I arrived. Working nights these past 2 years has messed with my head quite a bit, and I think I'm developing a bit of insomnia. For example, when I arrived at her aunt's house, I couldn't sleep at all. This has happened before, but I had never stayed up for more than 28 hours straight. Even if I tried, I knew I couldn't rest, especially since we had a full day ahead of us. We needed to take her cousins to school, go to a friend's gender reveal party, shop. We were out of everything at home since she'd been away for a few days, and I still had to be at the hospital to start my shift at 6. I ended up dozing for less than 10 minutes right there in the car. Sleep was almost winning, but when I arrived at work, I downed a giant Red Bull and another energy drink to keep going. I asked my wife to drive me to and from work since my car's brakes needed repair, and I didn't trust myself to drive hers after being up for more than 24 hours. It was Wednesday night, and I had been awake since Tuesday afternoon around 2. The shift started well. I knew that if I kept busy, the fatigue wouldn't hit me as hard. With my earbuds in, I restocked the surgical rooms to the sound of music. Since it was a weekday night, some surgeries were still underway, and the cleaning staff was tending to the used operating rooms. Sometimes the surgical staff would come into the room I was in to grab something they were missing in their room. At these times, I usually looked up, smiled, and they'd smile back. I was fully engrossed in my work, restocking the Omnicell machine and enjoying my music, when I heard the door behind me open. That characteristic sound, a high-pitched creak from hinges in need of oil, followed by the loud thud of a heavy wooden door closing. I turned, as I always did, to see who it was, but no one was there. I wasn't bothered. I thought maybe someone had opened the door, seen me, and preferred to go to another room. So I continued my work. When I pushed the cart to the next room, I noticed the light was off. I opened the door, and at that moment, I thought I saw someone crouched near the Omnicell machine, rummaging through the Sharps disposal bin. For those unfamiliar, this is a special bin for disposing of needles and vials after use, keeping them separate from regular waste. There was a case of someone who got caught doing this behind morphine and ended up fired. I turned on the light, ready to ask what the person was doing, but when the light came on, there was no one there. Okay, now I was starting to feel a slight chill. I didn't know how long someone needs to go without sleep to start hallucinating, so I convinced myself it was probably just my mind playing tricks. I took a deep breath, tried to calm down, finished restocking the surgical rooms without further incidents, and went back to the pharmacy. Every night, around 2 in the morning, we need to deliver specific medications to the nursing stations for patients. I'll use the 5th floor as an example to explain how the floors are organized. In the center, there are 3 elevators. Going to the left, you find sectors 5100 and 5200, and to the right, 5400 and 5500. Each side has 2 wings, one with rooms numbered from 5105 to 5115, and the other with rooms from 5201 to 5215. This pattern repeats on each floor, and to simplify, I'll refer to the sectors as 51, 52, and 5455. Recently, side 5455 of the 5th floor was under renovation. The patients were temporarily relocated to the 3rd floor, the so-called overflow floor. On that particular night, side 5455 was empty, as the hospital was relatively quiet. I went up through the hospital delivering medications floor by floor until I reached the 5th. After finishing the delivery on side 5152, I decided to check on the progress of the renovation on side 5455. Upon entering, I felt a chill. There were no nurses, no patients, just long, empty hallways. Although I'm used to walking around deserted areas like the surgical rooms, seeing the empty patient rooms brought a different kind of discomfort. I walked slowly through side 55. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a hospital bed shaking. Passing by room 5512, I saw what was causing the noise. Inside the room, an elderly man was trembling uncontrollably, as if he was having a seizure. Blood was streaming from his eyes, nose, and mouth, while he emitted a sound between a gargle and a groan, similar to the noises zombies make in the series The Walking Dead. The monitor beside him was blaring an alarm, the kind that sounds when a patient goes into cardiac arrest. My heart practically stopped when I saw that, and I quickly took a step back, leaning against the doorframe. I soon realized that this man urgently needed medical help, so I went back into the room without a second thought. But when I looked again, he was no longer there. The bed was perfectly made, the monitor was off, and there was no sign that anyone had been in that room for at least a day. At that moment, I thought I was definitely hallucinating. I hurried back to the elevators and went down to the 1st floor, where the pharmacy is. As soon as the doors opened, an elderly man wearing a security shirt and a hospital badge stepped in. As he passed by me, he gave me a light pat on the shoulder. It was the same man I had just seen convulsing and making those sounds. He smiled at me as the doors closed, and I stood there watching the numbers go up as the elevator took him back to the 5th floor. I didn't press any buttons to call the elevator back, but to my surprise, the same elevator returned to the 1st floor and opened its doors. But this time, it was empty. I rushed to the pharmacy and sat down, deciding to stay there until the end of my shift, waiting for my wife to pick me up. While waiting, I did a quick Google search on when hallucinations start after prolonged periods without sleep. What I found said something between 30 and 48 hours, and I was exactly in the 38th hour without sleep, so it seemed to make sense. The pharmacy is directly below sector 54-55, so when I leave, I can see the window at the end of the hallway on sectors 24, 34, 44, and 54. Sometimes, while waiting for the elevator on that side, I glance out the window. When I went out to my wife's car, I couldn't resist looking back at the window on the 5th floor. There he was, the same man, watching me from the window. A chill ran through me as I got into the car. I didn't say anything about what I had seen that night. To this day, I don't know why I would have imagined that specific man, as I've never seen him before, and he has no connection to my life. I'm still not sure if all of that was just a hallucination or if it really happened. It all felt so real. I fell asleep immediately when I got home, and since then, I haven't seen him again. But that was less than 2 weeks ago. I live with my boyfriend in his house, a modest residence in a nice neighborhood. The area is generally quiet with little violent crime. I call it modest because it's smaller than other houses in the neighborhood, but it's still well valued. Living in a smaller house here allows us to enjoy the city without needing $1 million property. It's a single-story construction with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a basement. We live on a very quiet street with plenty of privacy. The curve in the road helps maintain this privacy since when we step outside, there's no neighboring house directly in front of us. On our block, there are only 8 houses, and a little further along, there's a wooded area. Last October, my boyfriend, Marcelo, spent a weekend away in Las Vegas for a bachelor party. I was alone from Thursday to Monday. On Friday night after work, I invited some friends over for a wine night. At some point while we were in the living room watching horror movies, the doorbell rang. We fell silent, exchanging glances. The idea of the doorbell ringing late at night while watching a horror movie felt like something out of a film. I tried to discreetly peek through the window but couldn't see anything. There's a glass panel at the top of the door, so I looked through it. I noticed about 4 cars parked in the driveway. Whoever it was knew people were home, but I didn't see anyone on the porch. I returned to my friends, and though we found it strange, we ended up accepting that it could just be a prank. When everyone left, it was late enough for me to go to bed, but I ended up being woken up that same night, less than an hour later, with the doorbell ringing again, this time twice. I looked at my phone. It was around 1 in the morning, not a time for anyone to be at the door. I immediately called Marcelo, who answered with a rather drunk voice amidst the noise of a bar. He had to go to a restroom to hear me better. When he finally listened to me, he told me to stay in the room and not open the door for anyone. He didn't even mention calling the police, so I decided to set that idea aside, at least for the moment. After the call, I tried to calm myself down and go back to sleep. Just as my heart began to slow down and I was finally calming down, I heard a noise outside, something that sounded like a click. Right after that, I heard a knock on my window, followed by a male voice saying, "Hey, is anyone in there? I need help out here." At that moment, I was grateful that the blinds were closed. I couldn't see who was out there, and he couldn't see me either. But instead of leaving, he knocked again and said, "I know you're in there." That made me decide to call the police. I didn't hear footsteps moving away, so I figured he was still there, right by the window. During the call, I whispered the whole time, explaining that someone was trying to break into my house. It may seem like an exaggeration, but I was terrified and needed the police to arrive as quickly as possible. In about 5 to 10 minutes, the doorbell rang again, followed by firm knocks. I went to the front door and asked who it was. A male voice replied, "It's the police." It was a different voice from the man before. I looked through the glass and saw a few police officers. When I opened the door, the tallest officer, who was at the front, immediately entered, not even waiting for an invitation. He explained that they were responding to my call about a disturbance. I told him that there was a man lurking around the house, ringing the doorbell and knocking on the window. I don't want to focus too much on this part of the story, but that officer was the rudest man I'd ever met. He seemed to be on some kind of power trip. He treated me with disdain, ordering me to be quiet and interrupting me as I tried to explain the situation. Besides, he didn't seem to believe much in my concerns. His partner remained silent the whole time, just observing. The taller officer asked me questions about details that I had already said I didn't know, like the man's appearance, even though I'd made it clear that I hadn't seen him. At one point he said, "Well, you're the one who called us, ma'am. If you don't want our help, we can leave." I was stunned. I had never called the police before and honestly didn't expect such unprofessionalism. I apologized and explained that I was just scared. It was around this point that the two officers took a walk around the house with their flashlights. They did a complete circuit, but honestly didn't investigate much. I watched from the window. Afterward, they returned to the door and said that without cameras or proof that the man was trying to do anything illegal, there was nothing they could do. So, the two of them left. I didn't feel much safer, except maybe for the fact that whoever it was had probably seen I had called the police. I went back to bed, and fortunately, only woke up again to the sunlight coming through the blinds. It was around 10 in the morning on Saturday. Later that night, I was going to help organize a Halloween party that my friend was hosting. I spent the day grocery shopping and picked up some items for the party. I was going dressed as Velma from Scooby-Doo, and my friend, who was organizing the party, would be Daphne. I arrived at her house around 6 in the evening. The party started at 9 and really got going around 10:30. I stayed late and left a little after 1 in the morning. I was fine to drive, having only had a few beers. When I entered the house, I immediately noticed a draft. I placed my things on the dining table and noticed an open window. I closed it, trying to remember why I would have left it open. I went to brush my teeth, but when I left the bathroom, I found the basement door wide open. I froze for a few moments. Then, I began to hear a faint but continuous clicking sound. I approached the stairs leading to the basement and realized the sound was coming from down there. When I reached the top of the stairs and looked into the dark basement, the sound suddenly stopped. Then a voice from below said, You finally came home." I immediately slammed the basement door shut and left the house with my phone in hand. I went to the neighbor's house and knocked until he answered. I called the police from the safety of his home. Unfortunately, it was the same two officers who came to respond to the call. This time, my neighbor accompanied me to the door to speak with them, and I think that somewhat influenced the taller officer's attitude, as he was more restrained. He and his partner searched the house while my neighbor and I waited in the living room. After the initial inspection, I showed them some spots where I thought someone might have hidden. I basically turned the house upside down while on the phone with my boyfriend, who was still drunk. When I was sure the house was safe, I packed a bag to spend a few days with my sister until Marcelo returned. This time, I locked all the windows before leaving. The main lesson I learned from all this is that if you have windows that open wide enough for someone to fit through, make sure they're always locked when closed. We still live in this house, but I spent months unable to stay alone for long. To this day, I suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and sometimes have nightmares where I hear knocks on the window and wake up startled. My college years were undoubtedly some of the most memorable. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoy the life I live now, but those 4 years feel like they'll last forever in my memory. For anyone going through this phase now, my advice is simple. Don't underestimate it because it goes by fast. I studied at a seaside university with the campus literally right on the beach. This story takes place during the initiation ritual with my group. In case you don't know, this initiation is practically an entire semester of trials and challenges for everyone invited to join the fraternity. A lot of what happens during that time is best left unmentioned. But anyway, it was the last week before we would officially become fraternity brothers. Generally, this final week is when the fraternity amps up the challenges, so to speak. We knew that at some point during this last week we'd have to face the dreaded beach challenge. Here's basically what happened. The seniors took us about 20 kilometers along the coast on Friday night and gave us an hour to finish off an enormous barrel filled with who knows what. After that, they took us to the sand, tied our wrists together, blindfolded us, took our phones, watches and shoes, and left us there. Our mission was simple: return to the fraternity house before sunrise or we'd all be expelled. Honestly, I was pretty nervous about the situation, but I knew there wasn't much I could do, neither could anyone else. I remember that night being strangely cold. but the adrenaline of being so close to becoming a true brother overpowered all of that. Drinking the contents of the barrels was nothing new to us. We were already quite used to sharing the drink and even forcing it down when necessary. There were 15 of us. After we were tied together, everyone was blindfolded except Carlos, who was at the front of the line and would be our eyes, the only help we'd have. Our initiation master was a burly Mexican named Ramirez, but he insisted we call him Los Pollos, like the restaurant in Breaking Bad. He had a pretty peculiar personality. Before leaving to join the rest of the seniors, he reminded us of the rules one last time. Now we were left to our own luck. I won't mention everyone, but my closest friends in the group were Carlos, William, João, and Victor. I was at the very end of the line with William right in front of me. Carlos was leading the way. Without our phones, it felt like torture. We had no way of knowing how far we'd walked or how much time we had left. Our only option was to keep moving. At first, we tried to keep things light by telling jokes and chatting, but that quickly became exhausting. After what I estimated to be about 2 hours of walking, silence took over, only interrupted when someone stopped to vomit. I disconnected from the world. Even the sound of the ocean faded as I walked, lost in my own thoughts. It was absolute silence. Suddenly, I felt the rope around my wrists being pulled hard. I took a few steps forward and stopped, thinking William had fallen. He was a bit clumsier than the others, so it wasn't exactly surprising. I didn't have the energy to ask if he was okay, so I just waited. I stood there like a statue for a good minute. Something felt off. I was about to say something when the rope on my wrist was pulled again. I kept walking, relieved to know William hadn't passed out. The walk continued, and I drifted back into that numb state, feeling terrible. I could only pray that we were finally nearing the end. We had to be. Then, as I took what felt like my 1,000th step, I noticed something strange. Instead of stepping on damp sand, I felt my feet hit that thin layer of seawater. I kept walking, and the water rose a little, now reaching my ankles. It confused me. Why was Carlos leading us into the ocean? Once again, the rope around my wrists tugged, indicating that William and the others ahead were still moving, so I decided to do the same. In my mind, I thought maybe someone wanted to wash their feet for some reason. Since no one seemed bothered, I wasn't about to be the first to question it. For a while, the water stayed ankle deep following the ebb and flow of the waves. But then, after a moment, I felt it start to rise again, now reaching comfortably up to my shins. Carlos had to be messing with us. What other explanation made sense? As if this activity wasn't exhausting enough, we now had to deal with water, which would only slow us down. Soon after, I began to hear a distant sound. I focused and realized it was the sound of a boat engine running slowly. As we kept walking, the sound grew louder, indicating we were getting closer, or that it was coming our way. I was already pretty uncomfortable. The water was almost up to my knees, so I broke that silence that seemed to last for hours. "Guys, what are we doing in the water?" I waited, even more confused when I realized no one responded. "Guys?" I called out again, this time with a tone of concern. Nothing. Absolute silence. Panic began to take over, and the sensation of being blindfolded became unbearable. I needed to see what was around me. I lifted my wrists toward my face, trying to remove the blindfold. Just as I began, I felt the rope being pulled away, forcing my arms back down. I cursed, lowered my head, and managed to pull off the blindfold with my fingers before the rope was yanked again. To my horror, it wasn't William guiding me. Instead, I found myself looking into the eyes of a middle-aged man, holding the frayed end of the rope tied to my wrists. Shocked, I looked at the cut piece of rope in his hand, then saw what had made the cut: a long, rusty kitchen knife in his other hand. Behind him, a boat rocked in the waves, and I could make out 3 more shadowy figures aboard. I let out a desperate scream before he could react, pulling my arms up with all the strength I had. At the same time, I raised my foot and kicked him in the chest with all I could muster. Thankfully, the rope slipped from his hands. He tried to grab my shirt, but the fabric ripped with a loud tear. He fell into the water, clutching a large piece of my white t-shirt, but I was already running toward the shore as fast as I could, wrists still bound. Seconds later, I heard a distant splash. Someone had jumped from the boat. I didn't bother to look back. I just kept running. I was about halfway to the shore when something flew past my head, just inches from my right ear. It was the knife. I saw it pass by before disappearing into the water. I was in total shock, but adrenaline took over. As soon as I reached solid ground, I finally looked back. 2 men were in the water and 2 were still on the boat. They weren't following me anymore. They just watched in silence, expressionless. The closest one held a white piece of my shirt that he'd torn during the struggle. I didn't waste any time. I ran across the beach and headed straight for the street. It was already dawn, but the fraternity was the last thing on my mind. I flagged down the first car I saw, and after begging to use the phone, I called the police. It didn't help. By the time the officers arrived, the 4 men had disappeared, likely to somewhere with that boat. I made up a story for the police, worried about the possible consequences for the fraternity. Fortunately, they didn't ask too many questions. I didn't get too much flack from my fraternity brothers. In fact, they were more annoyed at Carlos for not noticing anything, though he swore he didn't hear a thing. After that, I was officially accepted as a brother and life went back to normal. Well, normal for a while. A few weeks later, some friends and I were playing beach die on the sand behind the house when João spotted something in the distance. A stick was planted in the sand, and tied to it was a piece of white fabric, the same fabric torn from my shirt. The pattern was unmistakable. It was definitely from my shirt. To this day, I have no idea how they knew which fraternity I belonged to. My brothers think they may have recognized the shirt fabric, but I have a darker theory. I believe they knew about our tradition of sending initiates to that beach at night, blindfolded and defenseless. Maybe the whole plan was to capture whoever they could. I had the misfortune of being at the end of the line, which still gives me chills when I think about it. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I'd gotten on that boat. The police, as always, were no help. It's been a few years, and they never found anything. About a year ago, I had an experience that I've finally decided to share now. I'm 19 years old and a college student, and at that time, I was in the process of joining a fraternity on my campus. I study at a university known for its parties, located in the southern part of the country where fraternity culture is taken very seriously. I won't go into details to preserve privacy, but on that specific night, I was at the initiation ceremony, the occasion when I and 20 other students would officially become fraternity brothers. During the admission period, which lasts a few months, the older members would put us through strange situations, peculiar tasks, like selling ourselves or taking us to unusual places. You know, those classic hazing pranks. That night, everything followed that pattern. Blindfolded, we left the fraternity house around 10:30 at night. The seniors took our phones and transported us to a secret location, divided into several cars to ensure everyone arrived at the destination. On the way, we tried to sing along to an old, funny song blaring at full volume, one of those annoying tasks we always had to do while still blindfolded. I think it was part of the whole hazing ritual. After about 20 minutes, the car stopped. I heard doors opening and closing, and soon I felt someone holding my arm, guiding me out of the vehicle without saying a word. We walked about 60 meters until I was told to sit and remain silent. I realized I was on grass, so I deduced we were probably in a field or something similar. From the sounds around, I noticed other people sitting too, and the seniors instructed each of us to remain quiet. After a minute of silence, a voice began speaking to us. It was about the fraternity, mainly highlighting how we were deemed worthy to be a part of it. I spent about half an hour there sitting in silence, only hearing occasional footsteps and movements around me. I imagined they might be conducting the final steps of initiation, taking each person for a one-on-one conversation. I wasn't sure, of course. With the blindfold on, my imagination did all the work. At a certain point, the footsteps disappeared, and all that remained were the sounds of crickets and the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. By then, I started feeling uncomfortable. It must have been 20 minutes of pure quiet. Then finally I heard footsteps approaching, and soon felt a firm hand grasping my wrist, guiding me somewhere. Not a single word was spoken. He also seemed to want to get this over with so I could remove the blindfold. As we walked, I felt the ground change from grass to a rougher surface, realizing we were entering a forest as branches and bushes scratched my skin as we passed. We walked for a while, and soon the blindfold started bothering my eyes. I mentioned it and asked to stop for a second just to adjust it. He stopped and released my arm. As I massaged my eyes under the fabric, a deep, raspy voice startled me. "Take it off." I hesitated, unsure of what to think as the voice was unfamiliar. Still, I removed the blindfold. What I saw surprised me. A tall man dressed in black, wearing a V for Vendetta mask. I let out a scream and jumped back. Part of me thought it was just a bizarre hazing prank, but before I could react, he lunged toward me, yelling that he was going to take me with him. We wrestled on the ground, and that's when I realized he was trying to choke me. I mustered all my strength to push him away, got up as quickly as I could, and ran in the opposite direction, guided only by the moonlight illuminating the way back. My heart raced as I kept glancing back, terrified at the thought he might be following me. After a while, I heard voices calling my name and nearly bumped into one of the fraternity brothers. Trying to gather my words, I explained to him, with a trembling, broken voice, that a masked stranger had taken me into the forest and attacked me. I could barely finish before 5 or 6 brothers rushed off with flashlights ready to search for the guy. One of them stayed with me to calm me down and escort me back safely. As we left the forest, I realized we were in a backyard, probably one of the brothers' houses. Most of the fraternity was gathered on the porch, looking at us with shocked expressions. I asked, bewildered, what was going on. They explained that since it was dark and I was the last in line, the brother who was supposed to escort me simply hadn't noticed I'd been left behind. Minutes later, one of them saw something moving in the forest, and that's when they realized I was missing from the group. I was so shaken that I didn't even have the strength to be angry. No one knew who that man was, but some began speculating he might be someone from another fraternity trying a prank. Shortly after, we saw the flashlights emerging from the forest and the brothers running back toward us with urgency on their faces. They told everyone to get out of there and return to campus as quickly as possible. Without a second thought, we obeyed. They locked the house and one of them called the police. During the drive back, I was bombarded with questions, and I tried to answer as best as I could, still confused and with my mind racing. I kept wondering who that man could be, the reason for the mask, and where he might have been trying to take me. The idea that he could be a member of another fraternity, trying to take me out of the game before initiation crossed my mind. But that didn't explain why the brothers locked the house and called the police. I only found out what had really happened the next morning when one of the brothers who ran after the masked man told me what they'd seen in those woods. And the truth was nothing I expected. As they ran, they noticed a distant light and fell silent. Approaching, they realized it was a bonfire in the middle of a clearing. Around the fire, several figures in black, wearing white V for Vendetta masks, were chanting and throwing objects into the flames. One of the brothers stepped on a branch, making all the masked figures turn to look at them. They froze, like they were in a horror movie. Suddenly, those mysterious men started running toward them. The brothers fled and told the rest of us to get out of there and call the police. It seemed we had accidentally stumbled upon some sort of cult ritual. For several nights, I couldn't sleep, trying to forget what had happened. But a detail I learned a few days later only increased my chills. While some brothers were playing soccer in the backyard of the house, they found a white V for Vendetta mask hanging on a nearby tree. They called the police, and the officers took it for analysis. I don't know if those people were ever caught or if the police looked into it deeply. I also have no idea what those masked figures were doing there in the forest. I've been thinking a lot about all this lately, and I'm relieved to have come out of it with nothing more than a crazy story. It's been a long time since I graduated from college. I studied at Cooper Union, a small character-filled technical school right in the heart of Manhattan. Having the chance to live in New York was an incredible experience, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in this world. Back then, there weren't many fraternities, so I joined as many as I could to make sure I'd always have parties and events to go to. I was a relatively average student, so getting an invite to these fraternities wasn't all that hard. Most of the initiation rituals were pretty tame, but I soon realized they hid something more. I hope it's okay to share this story, as it's been so long now that I feel safe enough to tell it. Honestly, I doubt the fraternity still does this today, and I really hope they don't. The big event of our initiation involved an exploration of the subway. I don't remember exactly where it was, but there was an old abandoned station that teens used to visit. The fraternity would lead us to one of the operational platforms, and from there we'd cross over to the deactivated station, take a few photos, and continue to the next active platform. We were given the subway schedules to make sure there would be no trains passing while we were on the tracks, and we had plenty of time to reach the abandoned platform, wait for a train to pass, and then head to the next station. I know you might be thinking the worst, but no one had to run from a train. The route was carefully planned, and we had plenty of time to cross safely. We just had to avoid the dreaded third rail, and everything would be fine. I've always enjoyed urban exploration, so for me this experience was more thrilling than scary. It was one of those early mornings around 3 when our fraternity brothers decided to take us to the subway. I'm sure they picked that hour because there were hardly any trains running, which kept us safe. There were about 10 of us in the group. Our school was pretty small, so you don't need to know everyone's names, but my closest partner among the initiates was an Albanian guy named Riker. Honestly, he was the funniest guy you could ever meet. We always joked that he should try stand-up. Oh, and he was also a big weed fan, which plays an important role in this story. We descended into the subway without any problems. Riker and I stayed towards the back because the rest of the group seemed a little hesitant to go ahead. The tunnel was really dark, and we were only given 2 flashlights to share. Those flashlights and a cheap film camera were all we had. Since I was at the rear, they handed me one of the flashlights, but I quickly gave it to another initiate who complained about not being able to see anything. We hadn't even walked for 30 seconds when Riker had his first big idea. He pulled out a pre-rolled joint from his jacket pocket, grinned, and motioned for me to stop. "I don't have enough to share," he whispered, pointing to the others who hadn't noticed what we were up to. Against my better judgment, I agreed. After all, when else would I have the chance to take a hit in a subway tunnel? The 2 of us smoked while watching the others drift further away, their laughter echoing more faintly. We finished the joint, and when we realized how far we'd fallen behind, we started walking back. Riker's weed was really strong. I was more affected than I'd have liked since my tolerance was nowhere near his. We picked up our pace to catch up with the group, but something ahead caught Riker's attention. Without a flashlight, we could only make out the silhouette of someone illuminated by the faint light of the tunnel. I squinted to see better. There was a person standing there right in the middle of the tracks facing us. It was really unsettling. "David!" Riker called out, breaking the silence in the tunnel. The figure didn't respond. Right after, we heard David's voice calling to us, but he was further ahead with the rest of the group. We were frozen. The person in front of us was a complete stranger. As if David's voice had been a signal, the person on the tracks started running toward us. We turned and bolted in the opposite direction. I was so high that I felt panic grip me. The figure's run was eerily silent, as if we were being chased by a shadow. They seemed way too light. Riker gripped my arm tightly, his usual confidence completely gone. "Quick!" he whispered, fear in his voice mirroring mine. I knew we still had time before the next train, but running the wrong way gave me a bad feeling. Riker seemed to think the same, because suddenly he pulled me to the side, signaling for us to cross to the other track. In hindsight, we could probably have kept running straight to the starting station, but I was so out of it that I just blindly followed Riker. We crossed the divider and ran back toward the abandoned station. The situation felt even scarier now. We had no idea when a train might appear on that track, but at least it seemed like we were going the right way, or so I hoped. Riker's maneuver seemed enough to throw off whoever was following us, but it didn't work. Our pursuer crossed the divider too and kept right on our heels. The problem was that there were very few places where the divider could be crossed, so now we just had to hope to find another one soon, before a train appeared. Going back to the divider we used was no longer an option. My heart pounded erratically, but Riker and I managed to put some distance between us and the pursuer. We kept running, desperately searching for a crossing point, but without success. Riker started cursing in a string and I felt nausea building. We kept the pace, still looking for a way to cross. Then the tracks began to tremble and a light appeared at the far end of the tunnel. A train was coming. We were really in a tough spot. I thought about turning to confront whoever was behind us, but suddenly Riker shouted, "Here!" running toward another crossing point. By sheer luck, we found another crossing point just ahead and managed to return to the original track. We ran a few more meters until we reached the rest of the group waiting on the platform. While I bent over to vomit, Riker frantically explained what had happened. He barely finished when a train shot by on the track next to us. Riker and the group were ready to confront whoever had chased us, but no one appeared. We feared the worst until we heard a crazed scream from far off. To this day, I have no idea how that person avoided the train. We waited for our track to clear and then got out of there quickly. Looking back, Riker and I probably crossed paths with some drugged-out homeless person who might not have been an actual threat. But in the moment, fear took over, which explains our impulsive decision to cross the divider. We both probably could have handled that guy, but honestly, I'm relieved we didn't have to. Few people experience something so impactful at a young age that it stays with them forever. I am one of those people. I must have been around 7 or 8 years old. My older brother and I grew up in a complicated household. Our mother raised us alone. Our father was irresponsible and disappeared from our lives. To support us, she worked 2 jobs. Sometimes she had to work night shifts, and on those nights it was usually our grandmother who stayed home to take care of us. My brother, Austin, is 2 years younger than me. Given the circumstances, we didn't have the privilege of having our own rooms. We lived in a small house, but for the 3 of us, with our mother's efforts, it was enough. However, the area we lived in wasn't the best. It was a night like any other. I don't remember if it was a weeknight or a weekend. I don't retain those small details, but I clearly remember being in the living room with my grandmother. She was watching TV while I played with my Legos on my little play table. I made quite a bit of noise and mess with them, to the point where my grandmother had to say several times, "Alex, be quiet." Austin was already in bed. My bedtime was 9:30. Since it was probably close to that time, I think it was a weekend night. If it were a school night, my bedtime would have been earlier. The layout of the house was simple. Living room, dining room, and kitchen were all integrated, and a hallway led to the bathroom and 3 bedrooms. Our mother's room was at the end of the hallway. Mine was in the middle. Our grandmother slept in our mother's room when she stayed with us. Eventually, it was time for me to go to bed. My grandmother also went to bed early, so after saying goodnight, she would go to the bathroom to brush her teeth and get ready for sleep. I was never afraid of the dark or anything like that. My mother always says I was a very brave child. But that night I woke up in the middle of the night, which was rare for me as I was a heavy sleeper. I heard a sound coming from the hallway, the floor creaking. The wooden floors of that house creaked every time someone passed through the hallway. I thought my grandmother was going to the bathroom, but the noise didn't stop. The creaks went back and forth. I got out of bed and went to the door to listen more closely. Now, I could also hear whispers. I was more confused than scared. I thought my grandmother was talking to Austin. I opened the door and looked down the hallway, and the image I saw still haunts me to this day. There was a tall, thin woman, completely naked, leaning against the wall with her head sunk between her arms. She was murmuring things to herself, and then in a quick movement, like a deer surprised by headlights, she turned her head to look at me. I let out a high-pitched scream, calling for my grandmother, and slammed the door shut. Right after that, the pounding on my door began, and the woman on the other side was shouting a name. "Jeremy! Jeremy! Open the door!" I kept screaming as loud as I could for my grandmother until I heard her voice echoing down the hallway. What struck me the most was her shout. "Get out of here!" The woman responded with a scream. "Where is Jeremy?" My grandmother, who was in her 60s at the time, was still incredibly agile. She told me to keep the door locked and managed to force that strange woman out of the house while calling the police. I don't even know how she managed to do that, but my grandmother was a brave person. The woman left the house shouting, "Jeremy," as she walked away. As soon as the door was locked, my grandmother came to embrace us, me and Austin, who was already awake and crying as well from all the commotion. We stayed together until the police arrived. When they left, my grandmother told us to go back to sleep. It was simply my grandmother's mistake for not locking one of the doors, combined with the fact that we lived in a somewhat sketchy area. That woman must have been under the influence of some drug or something. Seeing that at such a young age deeply affected me, I spent a long time unable to sleep alone. And it was this episode that, in fact, led us to leave that house shortly afterward. Let me set the scene before starting the story. When I was 19, I was living a pretty ordinary life. I had just finished high school the year before this story takes place. I'd always been a fan of anything related to horror, movies, games, jump scares, you name it, and I loved it. I never seemed to be afraid of anything, and I liked how it made me appear braver to the girls I was interested in or who showed interest in me. It was almost like having a superpower. My friend kept mentioning a REM-induced nightmare called sleep paralysis. I, however, had never experienced it. Isabella, my friend, suffered from intense lucid dreams. She told me several times that certain stimuli or external factors could invade her dreams and shape them into either a magical experience full of fun and wonder, or easily turn into a terrifying nightmare, as if straight out of hell. Being a light sleeper, I thought it unlikely that this would ever happen to me, so I brushed off the subject. One night, Isabella messaged me, asking me to come over because she had just gone through another one of these evil experiences due to her sleep condition. When I arrived, I found her sleeping again, seemingly in peace. I sat on the little stool she had in front of her vanity near the window and started playing something on my phone. After about 30 minutes, I figured she was sleeping soundly and that it was probably safe for me to leave, as long as I left a note letting her know I had stopped by as she had asked. Suddenly, Isabella woke up with a scream, but it wasn't an ordinary scream. It was a kind of scream I'd never heard before, especially from her. It was muffled, hard to describe. Her eyes widened, and I rushed to her side. I asked if she was having a nightmare. She started trembling. I tried holding her to calm her down, but the shaking only intensified. I asked what was happening, but she didn't answer. I thought it was just another one of her sleep paralysis episodes. I did my best to comfort her. After about 30 seconds, she managed to regain control of her body. I checked to make sure she was okay, and then went back home, as it was close to 1 in the morning. As soon as I got home, I received a frantic message from her saying, "The hallucinations won't stop." I asked her to explain what she meant, but I didn't get a response. After about 30 minutes, I decided to go back to her house. When I got there, I saw red and blue lights illuminating the porch and the street signs around. I ran to the house, desperate to understand what had happened. As I approached, I saw Isabella talking to one of the police officers at the scene. When I tried to speak with her, both Isabella and the officer took me to a more isolated area. What I found out still gives me chills to this day. Apparently, that night when I went to Isabella's house, she wasn't actually asleep. She was pretending. Right behind me, hidden in her closet, was a tall, skinny, homeless man. The police also found a large kitchen knife with him. The theory is that Isabella thought she was having an episode, but in reality, this very real man was silently approaching her in her room. It seems that my entry into the house was enough to scare him, making him hide, and my presence there kept him concealed. This gave Isabella enough time to call 911 and report the situation, which led to the police arriving shortly after I left. Fortunately, the man was quickly taken into custody. To this day, I don't know exactly what to think about that night, but it's likely that I saved her life simply by staying there, thinking I was helping her in a stressful situation. Had I arrived later, the events might have unfolded in a frightening and tragic way. I hope I never experience anything like that again. It would certainly be enough to finally awaken my fearful side. About 10 years ago, I made my first move, leaving my mother's house for my own apartment in Chicago. It was a good 3-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city, in a cozy neighborhood near the University of Illinois. I shared the space with 2 roommates, Miguel, who was a close friend, and Tiago, who was a friend of Miguel's and whom I didn't know very well yet, although we ended up getting along great. One night, about a month after the move, I went out for drinks with some friends at a bar closer to downtown, about 10 minutes from home. The night was fun, and I ended up having a few too many drinks. I grabbed a taxi around 1 in the morning and headed straight back to the apartment. When I arrived, I noticed Tiago's door was open, which meant he was probably at his girlfriend's place. Miguel's door, however, was closed, with the TV light spilling out from under it. I went to my room, turned on my TV, and lay down, ready to sleep. After about 10 minutes, I heard the doorbell. Half asleep, I woke up confused, since it was 1:30 in the morning, and ignored it. However, a few seconds later, the doorbell rang again, and then once more seconds later. It's worth mentioning that Miguel made good money selling marijuana to some people and was quite a frequent user as well. So, I figured he might have fallen asleep waiting for a late-night customer. With this idea in mind, I went to the intercom and asked who it was. A female voice replied, "It's Emilia, I came to see Miguel." Thinking my suspicion was correct, I opened the front door and went down the stairs. The building's door was made of tall glass, so I could see clearly who was outside. I noticed a blonde girl with glasses, with a college student look, waiting outside. I had never seen her before, but she looked harmless. Aside from a few occasional customers, Miguel also had girls visiting from time to time. So I dropped my guard and opened the door. The girl repeated what she had said on the intercom moments before. "Hi, I'm here to see Miguel." I replied, "All right, he's here, just follow me." I held the door open for her to enter. She grabbed the handle and I started climbing the stairs, expecting her to follow closely behind. However, as I climbed, I quickly realized that Emilia wasn't following me. I looked over my shoulder and saw she was still standing outside, holding the door open but now staring intently to her right, as if waiting for someone. A chilling sense of dread washed over me, and I sensed that something very wrong was about to happen. I picked up my pace, hurrying back to the apartment. As I turned the corner on the stairs, I heard the door open and heavy footsteps began echoing coming up the stairs behind me. I turned my head again, and what I saw froze me to the bone. A tall, skinny man with sunken eyes and long, greasy hair falling over his shoulders was running toward me up the stairs. He wore a sleeveless black shirt, and aside from some cheap tribal tattoos snaking up his arms, I noticed he was holding what looked like a lead pipe in his right hand. At that moment, adrenaline surged through me as I turned and bolted up the stairs toward my apartment. I rushed in, slammed the door, and locked it tightly. I stood there, staring at the closed door, completely paralyzed as the man banged on it 3 more times, cursing loudly. After a while, he gave up, going back down the stairs and exiting through the front. Instead of coming down to greet her in person, Miguel had simply heard her name on the intercom and, thinking she was a friend of mine, had buzzed her in. When she arrived at our unit's door, he opened it and let her in. Miguel said she seemed confused and mentioned she was looking for someone named Tim. He introduced himself and explained that no one by that name lived there. She stayed at the doorway, always stretching her arm to hold the door open until she left shortly after. Upon hearing this, I developed a theory. These people had shown up earlier, and without expecting anyone to let them in through the intercom, the girl had forgotten to keep the building door open, which prevented the man from entering on the first attempt. Either way, we were very lucky that night. We called the police, who came to get more details about the incident. They asked if we knew anyone who might want to harm us, to which we responded no, as this seemed like a completely random encounter. The officers left soon after, saying there wasn't much they could do. We never saw that girl, Emilia, or her despicable accomplice again.